coach has filed a petition looking for a district court to overturn his conviction on 45 counts of sexual abuse. State courts have refused to throw out Sandusky's conviction.
The tragedy of this crime, Judge John Cleland tells the man in the red prison uniform, is that it's a story of betrayal. In the Belafonte, Pennsylvania courtroom, Jerry Sandusky stands as former students, now adults, look on. He once walked the sidelines of one of the most powerful college football programs in America. Now he's listening to a judge explain why he will spend the rest of his life in prison. For decades, Sandusky was the trusted architect of Penn State's legendary defenses and the founder of a charity for boys. On the surface, he was the grandfatherly coach who dedicated his life to helping troubled kids. Behind that public image, investigators say, he was carefully choosing vulnerable boys, drawing them into his orbit, and abusing the trust their families placed in him. The man who claimed to be building character was secretly destroying it. He was born Gerald Arthur Sandusky on January 26, 1944 in Washington, Pennsylvania, and grew up inside the world of youth sports. His parents ran a local recreation center called the Brownson House, so from childhood he was surrounded by kids, teams, and authority figures in tracksuits. He became a defensive end and linebacker at Penn State, then returned as a young assistant coach in 1969 under legendary head coach Joe Paterno. Over the years, he developed a reputation as a defensive genius, helping the Nittany Lions win 2 national championships in 1982 and 1986. He was considered Paterno's heir apparent for years, and later he became known as the benevolent founder of the Second Mile, a charity he established in 1977 and aimed at-risk boys. That charity brought him exactly the children he wanted, those from difficult backgrounds, eager for attention, flattered by access to big-time football. Nothing in the public record suggests the kind of formative trauma that easily explains what he did. What is clear is that he had almost unlimited access to kids, and that almost no one questioned it. The pattern laid out in court stretched from the mid-1990s into the 2000s. Boys described being invited to practices, games, trips, and overnight stays at the Lash Building on Penn State's campus. They were given gifts, special access to the team, and the sense that they were part of something important. Over time, what began as horseplay shifted into boundary-crossing behavior and then into outright abuse. Some incidents took place in showers at the football facility, the very spaces where young men were supposed to be learning discipline and teamwork. Others occurred in the basement of Sandusky's home in State College, or on trips connected to his charity, including bowl games and out-of-state excursions. Several survivors said the attention they once craved became something they spent years trying to forget. The most unsettling element wasn't a single incident, but how long the pattern continued while adults around him failed to stop it. Warnings surfaced repeatedly. In 1998, a mother reported that Sandusky had showered with her 11-year-old son. The concern reached campus police and the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare. Investigators interviewed Sandusky, who admitted to the shower incident but characterized it as innocent. The district attorney at the time declined to file charges. A few years later, in 2001, graduate assistant Mike McQuarrie reported seeing something deeply troubling in a locker room shower late one Friday evening. He told head coach Joe Paterno what he had witnessed. The information went up the chain inside the university to athletic director Tim Curley and senior vice president Gary Schultz, but it did not trigger a full criminal case at the time. Sandusky was told not to bring second-mile children to campus anymore, but he was allowed to retain his emeritus status and access to facilities. Each missed opportunity extended the window in which he could keep going. It wasn't until 2008 when a high school wrestling coach reported that Sandusky had engaged in inappropriate behavior with a student that law enforcement began to connect the dots. Eventually, a multi-year investigation by the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office brought together multiple victims and witnesses, and prosecutors moved forward with a sweeping indictment. Sandusky was arrested on November 5, 2011, and charged with 40 counts of sexual abuse involving 8 boys over a 15-year period. The charges sent shockwaves through Happy Valley and the nation. Within days, both Paterno and University President Graham Spanier were fired. The scandal would eventually lead to NCAA sanctions, a $60 million fine, and the vacating of 111 Penn State football wins. But the focus remained on the man at the center, the coach who had used his status to harm children. The 2012 trial was short but devastating. It lasted just over a week, but the testimony will be remembered for decades. Men who had met Sandusky as children took the stand, describing how a famous coach had slowly crossed line after line. One victim, known in court documents as Victim 1, described years of abuse that began when he was in middle school. Another, Victim 4, testified that Sandusky had abused him more than 40 times. Victim 5 said he had been assaulted in the Penn State showers. The defense leaned on Sandusky's reputation, his charity work, and character witnesses, but the jury was unconvinced. Several jurors later said the defendant's own testimony, in which he admitted to showering with boys and touching them but denied sexual intent, was more damaging than helpful. On June 22, 2012, after deliberating for about 21 hours over 2 days, the jury found him guilty on 45 of 48 counts related to child sexual abuse. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Outside, crowds gathered, some cheering, others simply stunned that the man who had been a pillar of the community was now a convicted felon. At sentencing that October, Sandusky offered a long, defiant statement recorded on audio and played in court. He insisted he was the victim of a conspiracy, that he had been wrongly accused, and that he had dedicated his life to helping kids. The judge rejected that narrative entirely. Judge Cleland called the crimes a story of betrayal and noted that Sandusky had used his position to violate the trust of those who looked up to him. He handed down 30 to 60 years in state prison, effectively a life term for a man then 68 years old. Today, as of November 2025, Jerry Sandusky is serving that sentence at SCI Laurel Highlands in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Appeals have not brought him relief. His legal team has filed multiple motions over the years, including claims of ineffective counsel and challenges to the statute of limitations, but courts have consistently upheld his conviction. His name, once tied to trophies, championship rings, and game plans, is now shorthand for institutional failure and the dangers of unchallenged power. Documentaries like Happy Valley and investigative reports have dissected how a major university allowed a predator to operate in plain sight for so long. Was he a uniquely dangerous individual, or simply the most visible example of what happens when winning and reputation matter more than children's safety? The answer may lie in the fact that you can travel across the ocean to a pool in Ireland and find almost the same story playing out under different colors and a different flag.
I made a terrible mistake that I will forever regret. I was the adult and I bear the responsibility for failing to walk.
In Ireland, the man once described as the country's top swimming coach now carries a very different label. When Derry O'Rourke returned to court in 2024, he was an elderly man in a suit, listening as yet another survivor described the damage he had done to her life when she was a teenager in his squad. He had already served time. He had already been called to account for abusing numerous young swimmers in previous court cases that dated back to the late 1990s. This time, the judge called him what he had long been, a serial abuser of children. For years, Derry O'Rourke was seen as the driving force behind Irish competitive swimming. He coached at schools and clubs across the country, helping talented teenagers climb national rankings and compete internationally. Parents believed that putting their daughters under his guidance meant giving them a real shot at representing Ireland at major competitions. Girls believed that enduring his temper, his demanding training methods, and his intense focus was the price of success. Many had no idea that extra coaching sessions were part of a grooming process they would only understand decades later. Born in the mid-1940s in Ireland, he came up through a sports culture with minimal oversight and few safeguarding rules. The public record doesn't paint a detailed picture of his early years, but it does show his rise as a demanding coach whose approval could make or break a swimmer's career. He controlled access to travel, training times, and competitions. Survivors later described how he picked out certain girls for special attention, calling them into side rooms after practice, offering ride-home arrangements when parents were unavailable, or making sure they were alone with him during supposedly individualized training sessions. That was where the line between legitimate coaching and exploitation vanished entirely. The girl at the center of the 2024 case was just 13 years old when he began targeting her at a school in Leinster during the 1990s. He praised her potential, gave her the kind of focused attention most young athletes dream about, and then used that position of trust to abuse her in a small room off the pool, again and again over an extended period. She eventually left the sport entirely, unable to separate the water from the trauma. Swimming, once central to her identity and her social life, became a trigger for fear and shame. It took her more than 30 years to stand in a courtroom at Dublin Circuit Criminal Court and describe those memories in front of him. And when she did, she spoke not only about those encounters in the side room, but about the decades of pain that followed. Problems with trust, long-term psychological distress, difficulties in relationships, and the sense that a fundamental part of her adolescence had been stolen. By then, O'Rourke was not a new name to the Irish courts. In 1998, he was first convicted of sexually assaulting young swimmers and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Additional victims came forward over the years, leading to further prosecutions. In 2006, he received another sentence for similar offences involving different girls from his squads. More cases followed in subsequent years, making him one of the most notorious offenders in Irish sport. The 2024 prosecution added another layer, confirming that his pattern of conduct stretched back further and into more lives than earlier cases had captured. Each new case revealed another girl whose childhood had been marked by his crimes. Investigators built the new case using the survivor's detailed statement, corroborating records from the school and swimming programs, and the already established history of his offenses across multiple decades. With so many similar accounts from different time periods and locations, the court did not treat her story as an isolated allegation, but as part of a broader, well-documented pattern of predatory behavior. O'Rourke pleaded guilty to sexual assault charges in Dublin Circuit Criminal Court, sparing the victim the need to testify at trial. In July 2024, Judge Orla Crowe sentenced him to 10 years in prison, noting the profound and lasting harm he had caused. In her remarks, the judge acknowledged the courage it took for the survivor to come forward after so many years, and the fact that O'Rourke's repeated offences demonstrated a clear pattern of exploiting his position. The judge also noted that he had shown little genuine remorse over the years, often minimising his actions or blaming external factors. He is now serving that sentence in the Irish prison system, where he will likely spend his final years. His name is frequently mentioned in discussions about how sporting bodies failed to protect young people and how long it can take survivors to feel able to speak. National inquiries in Ireland have examined the systemic failures that allowed coaches like O'Rourke to abuse children for decades. Swimming Ireland has since implemented significant safeguarding reforms, including mandatory background checks, 2 adult rules for training sessions, and independent reporting mechanisms. Was he simply one ruthless individual who found a weak system, or the product of a culture that valued medals and international results over scrutiny and child safety? Whatever the answer, his victims have ensured that his legacy will not be defined by podium finishes or national records, but by the voices that eventually rose against him and changed how Ireland protects young athletes. From the echoing tiles of Irish pools, the story moves to quiet cabins in the Massachusetts woods, where boys at a summer camp were told that an Olympian could make them mentally unstoppable, and where mental training became the excuse for something far darker.
With a majority of them being indecent assault and battery on a person who has not attained 14 years of age, so minors. Officials say that the charge did not exist back
in the 1970s. At a prestigious boys' camp in Western Massachusetts, parents believed they were giving their sons a gift, a summer of discipline, camaraderie, and expert coaching. One of those coaches was an Olympian hurdler named Conrad Avondale Mainwaring. At camp meetings, he talked about mental toughness, visualization techniques, and the psychological edge that separated good athletes from great ones. In private, according to dozens of men who later came forward, he used those same ideas as a cover for systematic sexual abuse. Mainwaring had credibility that was hard to question. Born in Barbados on September 25, 1954, he competed as a hurdler on the international stage, representing Antigua and Barbuda at the 1976 Montreal Olympics in the 110-meter hurdles. While he didn't medal, the fact that he had competed at that level gave him enormous cachet in coaching circles. After his competitive days, he reinvented himself as a guru of mental training, moving between schools, universities, and camps in the United States and Canada. He worked at institutions including Syracuse University and the Rectory School in Connecticut, always presenting himself as someone who could unlock hidden potential. To parents and administrators, having an Olympian on staff was a major selling point. To young athletes, the idea of personal guidance from someone who had reached the highest level of sport was magnetic. There is no public record of specific childhood trauma or psychiatric diagnoses that explain his conduct. What emerges instead is a pattern. He understood early how prestige opened doors and how the language of psychology could be weaponized. At Camp Greylock in Beckett, Massachusetts, where he worked during the 1970s, he used that status to identify certain boys as special, those who showed promise, who were eager to please, who seemed to crave approval, and then invited them to private sessions meant to sharpen their mental edge. These meetings took place in small rooms or cabins, usually at night, away from the eyes and ears of other staff and campers. Survivors later described how those sessions began with seemingly legitimate breathing exercises, visualization techniques, and talk about energy, focus, and unlocking potential. They were told to relax, to trust the process, to let him guide them into a deeper state of awareness. The language was pseudo-scientific, borrowed from sports psychology, but twisted into something else entirely. Then the physical contact would begin, first presented as relaxation techniques or energy work, then escalating into clear sexual violations. Many of the boys were barely into their teens, had no vocabulary for what was happening, and were convinced that questioning the coach might cost them his support or mark them as not serious about their athletic development. The memory of those nights followed them into adulthood. Decades of anxiety, shame, confusion, and a deep sense that something fundamental had been taken from them. For years, nothing happened. Complaints were whispered among former campers, then dismissed or never formally recorded. Mainwaring moved on to other institutions, leaving behind unanswered questions and boys who thought they were alone in what had happened to them. It wasn't until investigative journalists revisited his past in the 2010s and began connecting scattered accounts that the full scope of his conduct started to emerge. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team, famous for exposing abuse in the Catholic Church, published detailed investigations in 2016 that brought his pattern into public view. Dozens of men from different eras and locations, some now successful professionals, some no longer involved in sport at all, realized they were describing the same modus operandi, the same language, even the same specific techniques. Eventually, Massachusetts prosecutors focused on the abuse that took place at Greylock in the 1970s. They charged Mainwaring with multiple counts of indecent assault and battery on children under 14, as well as counts of child rape. The investigation was complicated by the passage of time. Some incidents had occurred nearly 50 years earlier, but forensic interviewers were able to document consistent patterns across victim accounts, and several men provided compelling, detailed testimony. In court, survivors described how a place that was supposed to be about friendship, outdoor adventure, and personal growth had been turned into a setting for systematic violation. The evidence spanned decades and included testimony from men who had carried these secrets for more than 40 years, some of whom had never told their own families. In February 2024, facing overwhelming evidence, Conrad Avondale Mainwaring pleaded guilty to 6 counts of child rape and 12 counts of indecent assault and battery on a child under 14. The plea spared survivors the need to testify at trial, though several chose to speak at sentencing. At the May 2024 sentencing hearing in Berkshire Superior Court, several survivors addressed him directly. One of them, a man now in his 60s, summed up their collective feelings in a single line: "Monsters should not be forgiven, only caged." Another spoke about how the abuse had affected his entire adult life, his relationships, his sense of self, his ability to trust. Judge John Agostini listened carefully to each statement before imposing concurrent prison terms totaling up to 11 years. At 70 years old, Mainwaring now faces the prospect of spending much of his remaining life behind bars. As of November 2025, he is serving his sentence in the Massachusetts state prison system. His case is now often cited in training sessions on safeguarding as an example of how abusers can cloak themselves in the language of high performance, psychology, and personal development. Was his obsession with mental training really about pushing athletes to their best, warped over time into exploitation, or was that obsession always just a story he told to gain access to boys? The men who sat in that courtroom don't need a neat answer. For them, justice was finally hearing a judge acknowledge what happened, seeing their experiences validated in a legal setting, and watching the door close behind the man who used an Olympic label as a license to harm. From remote cabins in the Berkshires, the story moves into the heart of a suburban community where a youth football coach wasn't an outsider at all, but someone everyone knew, someone who blended in so well that even forged documents didn't raise enough alarm. In Norwell, Massachusetts, Derek G. Sheehan was the guy everyone recognized. He coached youth football for local teams, joked with parents on the sidelines, and opened his home to neighborhood kids for sleepovers and game nights. When federal agents finally arrested him in July 2019, they had already seen images and videos that turned that familiar face into something else entirely. On the surface, Sheehan fit the template of the community coach. Approachable, funny, deeply involved. Born around 1971, he spent years around local sports programs in the South Shore area, slowly becoming part of the fabric of Norwell. Parents allowed their sons to stay overnight at his house because he seemed like the kind of adult every team needs. A volunteer who goes above and beyond, who doesn't just show up for games, but invests in kids' lives. He hosted team parties, organized carpools, and was always available when parents needed help. The public record doesn't offer a detailed account of his early life. What it does reveal is that he worked hard to embed himself in families' trust. He normalized extended contact with boys he coached, extra time after practice, rides home when parents were running late, and an open door policy where the team could hang out at his house, play video games, and stay for sleepovers. At least one family later discovered that when concerns were raised about his behavior, Sheehan had gone so far as to create fake documents that looked like official messages from authorities clearing him of any wrongdoing, a level of deception that shows how far he was willing to go to maintain his access to children. Inside his home, according to federal prosecutors, that access became opportunity. Over a period spanning roughly 2017 to 2019, he sexually abused boys who were around 11 and 12 years old, often while they were asleep during overnight stays. He recorded some of the abuse using cameras and phones, turning his guest rooms into unknowing crime scenes. The images and videos were disturbing not only for what they showed, but for the ordinariness of their setting. A standard suburban bedroom, a child in pajamas who believed he was safe with a trusted coach, an adult who should never have been there in that way. The investigation began when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received reports from technology companies about illegal material being uploaded and shared online. That digital trail led back to accounts and IP addresses associated with Sheehan. When federal agents and local police executed a search warrant at his Norwell home in July 2019, they recovered multiple electronic devices containing footage that matched identified victims and specific dates. Local police and federal investigators from Homeland Security investigations worked together, uncovering both the exploitation caught on camera and additional allegations from another boy who told Massachusetts state authorities about ongoing abuse that had occurred over an extended period. Facing devastating evidence, Sheehan eventually pleaded guilty in federal court to multiple counts related to the production and distribution of child sexual abuse material. The charges carried mandatory minimum sentences due to the nature of the offenses. At sentencing in Boston Federal Court in 2021, U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani heard victim impact statements from families describing the lasting trauma. One parent spoke about how their son, once an outgoing athlete, had become withdrawn and struggled with trust. The judge imposed a 45-year sentence, 540 months, making it highly unlikely that Sheehan will ever leave prison alive. He would be in his 90s before becoming eligible for release. Separate state charges in Plymouth County Superior Court, including aggravated rape of a child and indecent assault and battery on a child under 14, added another layer of legal consequences. Those charges were resolved through arrangements that allowed the federal sentence to stand as the primary punishment, ensuring he would serve decades in federal custody before any state matters would be addressed. He is now serving that long federal term at a federal correctional institution, with state matters essentially resolved through concurrent arrangements. For Norwell, the fallout has been intense and prolonged, a community forced to confront how easily a predator can hide behind the trappings of normal life, how the very qualities that make someone seem trustworthy, friendliness, availability, enthusiasm, can be part of a carefully constructed facade. When the person running drills on the field is also the person parents trust with overnight care, where should the line be drawn? The Sheehan case suggests one answer, that proximity and familiarity are not enough. They can, in fact, be part of the camouflage. Youth sports organizations across Massachusetts have since revised their policies, implementing rules that discourage one-on-one contact and overnight stays, require background checks, and create clear reporting channels for concerns. If Sheehan used the physical space of his home and team activities to prey on boys, the next coach took the same idea of access and extended it into the digital world, turning phones, apps, and social media into tools for reaching a far larger group of victims across years. In Minnesota volleyball circles, Dorian Christopher Bars was seen as a rising coach with a bright future. He ran clinics, helmed high school and club teams, and offered private training to girls hoping to earn college scholarships. Parents praised his dedication and posted glowing reviews online. Athletes shared photos with him on social media, thanking him for his mentorship. In April 2025, a federal judge called his conduct every parent's nightmare as she sentenced him to more than 33 years in prison. Bars was younger than many of his coaching peers, which helped him connect with players in a way that seemed natural. Born in the late 1980s, he coached at Maple Grove High School in suburban Minneapolis and with Northwest Juniors Volleyball Club, one of the region's competitive programs. His social media presence made him seem both professional and approachable. He posted motivational quotes, training tips, and photos from tournaments. Families saw him as a hard-working mentor who could open doors to university programs and help their daughters achieve athletic dreams. Hidden behind that carefully curated persona, according to federal prosecutors, was a web of fake online identities and private messages aimed at exploiting the very players he was supposed to protect. There is no widely documented trauma history or mental health profile that easily explains his behavior. What the court record does show is his fluency in digital culture and his understanding of how teenage girls communicate. For almost a decade, he blended his coaching role with a constant online presence. He messaged players late at night, sometimes posing as a peer, using fake social media accounts with profile pictures stolen from other teenagers, sometimes contacting them directly as himself. He learned their insecurities, their hopes about playing time and college recruitment, their fears about disappointing parents, and used that information as leverage to manipulate them. Court documents revealed that from around 2014 to 2024, Barrs coaxed, manipulated, and pressured teenage girls, some as young as 14, into sending him sexually explicit photos and videos. Many of these girls were on teams he actively coached. Some initially thought they were interacting with a boy their own age through the fake profiles he had created, only discovering later that it had been their coach all along. Others knew it was their coach from the start, but felt they couldn't refuse without risking their place on the team, their playing time, or their chances at a college scholarship. In certain cases, investigators say, the online conversations led to in-person encounters that crossed into direct sexual abuse. The number of identified victims reached at least 19, with 14 being his own current or former players. The truth started to surface in early 2024 when one brave victim confided in a trusted adult outside the volleyball program, and that adult immediately contacted law enforcement. Federal investigators from Homeland Security Investigations and the FBI began tracing usernames, email addresses, and social media accounts back to devices associated with Barrs. They executed search warrants and seized phones, computers, and tablets that contained a massive trove of illegal material and incriminating messages. As news of his March 2024 arrest spread through the Minnesota volleyball community, more victims came forward, and a clearer picture emerged. This was not a brief lapse in judgment, but a sustained, calculated pattern that had evolved as platforms and technology changed from Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat. Barrs eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges including production of child sexual abuse material, coercion and enticement of a minor, and receipt of child pornography. Each charge carried significant mandatory minimum sentences. At the April 2025 sentencing hearing in U.S. District Court in Minneapolis, families packed the courtroom. Several victims, now young adults, read impact statements describing how his betrayal had affected their mental health, their relationships, and their love of volleyball. One said she had quit the sport entirely because she couldn't separate it from the trauma. Judge Catherine Menendez spoke directly about the breach of trust, about a coach who had used his position, his knowledge of each girl's vulnerabilities, and the power dynamics inherent in youth sports to break the very trust that allowed him to build his career. The sentence, 400 months or 33 years and 4 months in federal prison, followed by lifetime supervision, reflected both the number of victims and the duration of his offending. As of November 2025, he is in federal custody at a facility that has not been publicly disclosed for security reasons. His case has become a cautionary example in discussions about online grooming in youth sports, featured in safe sport training and used by volleyball organizations nationwide to illustrate the dangers of unmonitored digital contact between coaches and athletes. It serves as a reminder that the person texting a teenager at midnight asking for photos under the guise of trust or team bonding may also be the person drawing up plays, running practices, and giving inspirational speeches about dedication and hard work. Barrs weaponized phones and apps to reach his victims. The next coach in this documentary didn't rely on technology as much as on something even more powerful in some communities: religion. He presented himself as a Christian mentor who could strengthen both body and spirit, and used that spiritual image to close in on his young clients.
During opening statements, Thomas's attorney told jurors the testing had a legitimate purpose for a competitive basketball program.
His judgment, you may find, was off.
At first glance, strength in Christ athletes looked like the answer to a problem many parents quietly worry about: how to find a training environment that pushes their kids athletically without exposing them to the negative culture that can surround competitive sports. The man behind it, Aaron Thomas Corrado, promised to build champions on and off the field by combining intense strength and conditioning workouts with Christian teaching and spiritual mentorship. In late 2025, a Colorado judge sentenced him to 76 years to life in prison for systematically abusing that sacred trust. Corrado, in his early 50s when he was sentenced, had spent years branding himself as a faith-driven coach and trainer. Born around 1973, he operated gyms and training facilities in the Denver suburbs, including locations in Castle Rock and Highlands Ranch that catered to teenagers with serious athletic ambitions across multiple sports. His social media feeds featured Bible verses alongside videos of heavy lifts, transformation stories, and testimonials about how he had changed young lives. Parents believed they were dropping their children off somewhere safer and more values-oriented than the average commercial gym. Some saw him as the positive male role model their kids didn't have at home, someone who could instill discipline, faith, and a strong work ethic. Little is publicly known about his upbringing beyond his long-standing involvement in strength and conditioning and his vocal Christian faith. What became abundantly clear at trial is how masterfully he blended the roles of trainer, life coach, and spiritual guide. He hosted prayer circles before and after training sessions, spoke about God's purpose and plan for each athlete, and told certain young people that the Almighty had big plans for them, and that he, as their coach and mentor, was central to helping them fulfill those divine plans. That kind of framing made it psychologically much harder for teenagers to question his behavior or set boundaries. To doubt the coach was, in his framing, to doubt God's plan. Between roughly 2019 and 2022, he used that carefully constructed influence to target at least 2 teenage girls in his programs. According to testimony at trial in Douglas County District Court, the abuse often took place during private training sessions when no one else was present in the facility. At first, the sessions looked like legitimate one-on-one coaching, close observation of form, hands-on adjustments during lifts, intense motivational talks about discipline and destiny. Over time, those interactions shifted in disturbing ways. Physical contact became inappropriate, lingering far longer than necessary for any coaching purpose. Comments took on a tone that had nothing to do with athletic performance. Some survivors testified that he invoked spiritual language to justify physical closeness, implying that doubting him or resisting meant doubting God's will and risking their spiritual and athletic potential. The first major break in the case came not from an athlete or parent, but from inside his own home. His then wife discovered messages, notes, and other materials that deeply concerned her. Instead of remaining silent or handling it privately, she brought those concerns directly to authorities in Douglas County, Colorado, triggering a broader investigation. Detectives interviewed athletes past and present, reviewed digital communications on phones and computers, and pieced together overlapping accounts from girls who had each believed they were alone in what they had experienced. The stories were disturbingly similar. The spiritual language, the isolated training sessions, the boundary violations that escalated over time. When word reached Corrado that he was under criminal investigation, he made a decision that prosecutors would later argue showed consciousness of guilt. He fled Colorado. He was eventually located in Arizona and arrested by authorities there before being extradited back to Colorado to face charges. The flight added another layer to the case, suggesting he knew exactly what he had done and feared the consequences. In 2025, after a trial that included emotional testimony from survivors and their families, a Douglas County jury found him guilty on multiple counts, including sexual assault on a child by one in a position of trust. Charges that carried enhanced penalties specifically because of his role as a coach and mentor. At sentencing, survivors described in victim impact statements how he had shaken not just their sense of physical safety, but their relationship to faith itself. To be harmed by someone who constantly invoked God's name, who framed himself as a spiritual leader, was a particular kind of betrayal that went beyond the physical violations. One survivor said she had stopped going to church entirely because of the association. Judge Teresa Cisneros, clearly moved by the testimony, imposed an indeterminate sentence of 76 years to life, ensuring that Corrado is almost certain to die in custody. As of November 2025, he is housed in the Colorado Department of Corrections. His gyms are permanently closed, and his story is now used extensively as a case study in how spiritual authority and religious language can be twisted into tools for control and manipulation. When a coach speaks with the voice of both fitness expert and pastor, framing his guidance as divinely ordained, how is a teenager supposed to push back without feeling like she's failing both athletically and spiritually? The answer, in his case, came from a spouse who chose truth over loyalty, and from survivors who found the courage to speak, even knowing how disruptive and painful those words would be. If Corrado shows how abuse can hide under the language of faith and divine purpose, the next coach shows how it can hide in plain sight in an ordinary British gym, where traditional discipline and precision training at the bars and beams were used as cover for a decades-long pattern of harm. By the time he was sentenced in 2025, former gymnastics coach Michael Haynes was 76 years old, an elderly man standing in the dock at Manchester Crown Court, facing words like campaign of assault and prolonged abuse from a judge. For two women who had once been girls at a gymnastics facility in Trafford, his age didn't soften what he had done or diminish their need to see him held accountable. They had waited decades for this moment. Haynes spent years inside the small but intense world of British club gymnastics. Born in 1949, he worked at facilities in the Greater Manchester area during the 1980s and 1990s, a time when safeguarding protocols were minimal and coaches wielded enormous, largely unchecked power. Parents knew him as a strict, old-school coach who demanded hard work, perfect technique, and absolute obedience. For girls under his instruction, his approval was a powerful form of currency. Being chosen for extra one-on-one sessions or additional training time could feel like a sign that they were destined for regional or even national competitions. Public reporting does not supply many details about his youth or what led him into coaching. What the pattern described in court makes clear is that he understood how to exploit the coach-athlete power dynamic. He singled out certain girls when they first arrived at the club, identified those who were especially eager to please or who came from families that deferred completely to his expertise, and began offering them extra attention that seemed, on the surface, like dedicated coaching. He normalized being alone with them. Extra time on apparatus when others had gone home, offers of lifts in his car when parents couldn't pick them up, and even invitations to his house under the guise of team events or additional training. The line between legitimate coaching and inappropriate personal access blurred until there was no line at all. The offences for which he was ultimately convicted occurred in the 1980s, which is why they are described as non-recent or historical in court records and media coverage. One woman, now in her 50s, testified that he had subjected her to repeated sexual assaults over a prolonged period that began when she was a young girl, at the gym during those supposedly extra training sessions, in his vehicle during rides home, and at his home when he had engineered reasons for her to be there. Another survivor told a story with disturbingly similar beats: gradual grooming through special attention and praise, followed by boundary violations that escalated over months and years into unmistakable sexual abuse. Both women spoke in court about the way those experiences had fundamentally warped their sense of trust, shattered their enjoyment of a sport they had once loved, and cast long shadows over their adult lives. The case began when one of the women, after years of carrying the weight of what had happened, reported the historic abuse to Greater Manchester Police. Specialized officers trained in handling non-recent sexual abuse cases interviewed her in painstaking detail, using trauma-informed techniques. They then began the difficult work of tracing other former gymnasts from that era, many of whom had scattered across the country or even abroad. As they spoke to more women, another survivor came forward independently, and the accounts powerfully reinforced each other. Different women, different time periods within the same era, but the same pattern, the same tactics, the same man. Records from the gymnastics club, though incomplete, confirmed Haynes's role and the access he had to young athletes. Eventually, prosecutors brought 20 charges against him, including multiple counts of indecent assault on a child. The case was complicated by the passage of time. Memories had faded, some potential witnesses had died, and physical evidence was non-existent. But the consistency and credibility of the survivors' accounts proved compelling. After a trial at Manchester Crown Court that laid out years of systematic misconduct, a jury found him guilty of numerous offences spanning multiple victims and years. At sentencing in 2025, Judge Maurice Green spoke at length about the sustained, calculated nature of the abuse and the immense courage it took for the women to come forward after carrying these secrets for more than 3 decades. He noted that Haynes had shown no genuine remorse and had forced his victims to endure a trial rather than admitting his guilt. The 18-year prison term handed down to a man in his late 70s means that he is extremely unlikely to ever be released. Given his age and the length of the sentence, he will almost certainly die in custody. As of November 2025, Michael Haynes is serving his sentence in the UK prison system and will remain on the sex offenders register for life, subject to monitoring and restrictions should he somehow survive to see release. For the women he harmed, the sentence is not a cure. It does not give them back their childhoods or erase decades of pain, but it does send an important message. That time does not erase responsibility, that survivors will be believed even when they come forward many years later, and that local clubs and community sports programs are not immune to the need for rigorous safeguarding and accountability. If Haynes's crimes unfolded in a traditional gymnastics facility, the next coach ran his own training space out of something far less formal. A garage in suburban California, decorated with Olympic memorabilia and championship medals, where the promise of elite instruction from an Olympian masked an entirely different and darker reality.
He's now facing numerous felony charges, including lewd and lascivious acts with a child under 18 years old. Today, he pleaded not guilty. The prosecutor read victim.
In Roseville, California, neighbors knew that the house with the wrestling mats spread across the garage floor belonged to someone special, an Olympian. Quincy Lee Clark had represented the United States in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Years later, after his competitive career ended, parents saw his home gym as a rare and valuable opportunity for their children to learn technical wrestling from someone who had competed at the absolute highest level. In 2024, a California judge sentenced him to nearly 2 decades in state prison for systematically abusing that trust with 2 teenage girls he coached in that very garage. Clark's athletic resume was genuinely impressive. Born on March 9, 1972, in Lemoore, California, he wrestled at the collegiate level at the University of Nebraska, where he was an All-American. He won a silver medal in the 85-kilogram division at the 1999 Pan American Games in Winnipeg, and then represented the United States at the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney, competing in Greco-Roman wrestling. While he didn't medal in Sydney, the fact that he had reached that pinnacle gave him enormous credibility. After retiring from competition, he shifted into coaching, eventually running a private training program out of his garage in Roseville. The setup looked ideal to many families, a small focused environment where young wrestlers could get individualized, high-level attention from someone who had been exactly where they wanted to go. There is no widely shared story of early trauma or dysfunction in his background that appears in public records. What stands out instead in the court case is the extraordinary control he had over his training space and his athletes. In his garage, there were no assistant coaches watching, no administrators dropping by, no other parents present, just Clark and whichever athlete he was training at any given time. For parents who saw his Olympic credentials and the medals and photos on the walls, that intimacy and individual focus seemed like a significant benefit, a chance for their children to get coaching that simply wasn't available in larger programs. For two teenage girls who trained with him, according to detailed court records and testimony, that isolation became the backdrop for crimes that would leave lasting scars. The girls he was convicted of abusing were in their mid-teens when they began training with him, drawn by his reputation and the promise of advancing their wrestling skills. Prosecutors described in detail how he groomed them methodically with praise, special attention, and the construction of a mentor-student relationship that felt important and unique. Extra sessions outside regular training times were framed as proof of their potential and his investment in their success. Over time, during these isolated sessions, physical instruction crossed clear boundaries into contact that had no legitimate place in coaching. The garage, once a symbol of Olympic dreams and hard work, became a place the survivors associated with fear, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. The investigation began when concerns about his behavior with young female wrestlers reached the Roseville Police Department. Detectives from the department's Crimes Against Children unit interviewed current and former athletes, parents, and others who had spent time in Clark's program. Two girls came forward with detailed, credible accounts of abuse. Their stories mirrored each other in troubling ways. The isolated one-on-one sessions, the escalating inappropriate physical contact, the pressure to stay quiet because of his Olympic status, and the fear that speaking out might damage their own reputations in the wrestling community. Additional evidence, including witness testimony and corroborating details, helped prosecutors build a strong case. In April 2024, after a trial in Placer County Superior Court, a jury convicted Quincy Lee Clark on numerous felony counts related to his conduct with the two minors, including multiple counts of lewd acts on a child 14 or 15 years old. The convictions carried serious penalties under California law. At the July 2024 sentencing hearing, Judge Colette M. Humphrey listened to victim impact statements from both survivors and their families. One girl described how the abuse had derailed her love of wrestling and left her struggling with trust and self-worth. The judge imposed a sentence of 19 years and 4 months in California State Prison and ordered that Clark register as a sex offender for life under California's tier system. As of November 2025, Clark is serving his sentence in a California State correctional facility. His case has prompted difficult conversations in wrestling communities about the risks of private, one-on-one coaching environments and whether Olympic credentials make coaches less likely to face scrutiny. In this instance, the medals on the wall and the photos from Sydney did not protect two teenagers. Instead, they helped create an aura of trust that Clark systematically exploited. From a garage gym in California, the story moves to Idaho, where a coach's influence extended beyond any training space into group homes and residential facilities for kids already on the margins. Children in foster care who believed that this time the adults around them might actually be safe.
Thank you, and I'll call the case. This is CR 2024-3277, State of Idaho versus Maxie Nathaniel Riddle.
In eastern Idaho, the name Maxie Riddle was known in two overlapping but distinct worlds: youth mixed martial arts programs where he taught techniques and discipline, and group homes for teenagers in state care where he worked as staff or supervisor. To some in the community, he was a tough but caring coach and a steady adult presence in the lives of struggling kids. To several young people who came into contact with him, he was the latest in what was often a long line of adults who had betrayed and harmed them. In 2025, he received a 34-year prison sentence for serious offenses involving vulnerable minors who should have been safest under his professional care. Riddle, in his late 30s at the time of sentencing, lived and worked in communities in Bonneville and Bingham counties where many young people already carried extraordinarily heavy personal histories. Born around 1987, he was involved in local martial arts training programs and also held positions in residential facilities meant to provide structure, safety, and support to children who could not live with their biological families due to abuse, neglect, or other serious issues. That combination, coach and caregiver, mentor and supervisor, gave him access to some of the most vulnerable teenagers in the entire region, kids who desperately wanted to trust an adult and who often had few other places to turn. Publicly available information does not outline his early life or background in any detail. What the charging documents and court proceedings demonstrate clearly is a calculated pattern of targeting girls who had already been failed by multiple systems and adults. Charging documents from both Bonneville and Bingham counties described offenses that took place over several years, often involving girls who were living in foster placements or group home settings where Riddle worked. In more than one case, the victim was a teenager dealing with significant instability, trauma from past abuse, and a profound need for someone trustworthy in her life. One of the main victims in the Bonneville County case met Maxie Riddle when he was employed at a group home where she had been placed by the state. At first, according to her later testimony, he seemed like a genuinely supportive adult who cared about her progress, who encouraged her, and who seemed different from other staff. Over time, boundaries began to erode in ways she didn't initially recognize as dangerous. Small favors became larger ones. Conversations turned increasingly personal and inappropriate. Eventually, his behavior crossed lines that should never be crossed in any professional setting, leaving her feeling trapped in an impossible situation where the staff member supervising her daily life, controlling her privileges and freedoms, was also the source of ongoing harm. Another case, filed in neighboring Bingham County, involved repeated serious misconduct toward a different girl over an extended period, following a similar pattern of grooming and exploitation. The first major step toward accountability came when other staff members at one of the group homes raised concerns about Riddle's behavior with residents to their supervisors, who in turn contacted law enforcement. Detectives from multiple agencies began interviewing current and former residents of the facilities where he had worked, as well as staff members and others with knowledge of his conduct. A disturbing pattern quickly emerged across multiple victims and locations. As the investigation broadened and more victims were identified, separate counties filed criminal charges, including multiple counts of lewd conduct involving a minor and related serious felonies. Local news coverage made clear that this was not a single isolated episode, but rather a series of calculated incidents spread across several years and multiple facilities. In Bonneville County, after extensive legal proceedings, Riddle ultimately pleaded guilty to one felony count of lewd conduct with a minor under 16 as part of a negotiated plea agreement that resolved some, though not all, of the many charges he faced across jurisdictions. At the January 2025 sentencing hearing in Bonneville County, one teenage survivor stood before the court and read a powerful victim impact statement that would later be quoted in nearly every news article about the case. Looking directly at Riddle, she said, "You did not destroy me. I'm still here. I'm still standing. I will not stay silent." Her words perfectly captured both the harm he had caused and the resilience she had found. Other victims submitted written statements describing the lasting impact of his betrayal. 7th District Judge Joel Tingey, after hearing all the evidence and statements, imposed a unified sentence of 34 years in prison, with 17 years of that sentence fixed before Riddle would even be eligible for parole consideration. The sentence reflected both the severity of the individual acts and the broader pattern of predatory behavior targeting the most vulnerable children. As of November 2025, Maxie Riddle is incarcerated in the Idaho Department of Correction, with many decades to serve before any possibility of release. For the girls he harmed, many of whom were already dealing with the psychological fallout of earlier abuse and abandonment, his conviction and imprisonment close one painful chapter but cannot erase or rewrite their difficult histories. His case raises a particularly urgent and uncomfortable question. When the state removes children from dangerous homes and places them in institutions specifically designed to protect them, who is watching the adults inside those institutions? When a coach who is also a caregiver exploits that dual role, the damage is compounded in ways that are difficult to quantify. The final case in this series returns us to a scene that seems almost mundane in its ordinariness: a youth soccer camp on a summer afternoon, a parked van, and a 10-year-old girl who thought her coach was simply being kind by offering her a treat.
26-year-old Dean Fowl stared straight ahead as the charges were read to him in a Washington County courtroom. He is facing multiple counts of sex abuse, which police say began when the victim was just 4.
On a warm summer day in 2022, in Brooklyn's Marine Park, a 10-year-old girl left a youth soccer camp run by the man who owned and operated the program. According to detailed court testimony that would emerge 2 years later, he bought her an ice cream cone and invited her into his van, ostensibly to give her a ride or to talk. Once the van doors were shut and they were alone, her coach was no longer acting like a coach. He was a grown man using his absolute control over a child's environment and her trust in him to commit an act she would later describe to police detectives, forensic interviewers, and ultimately a jury in painful, precise detail. The coach was 52-year-old Stanislav Rozovsky, a longtime resident of Brooklyn's Sheepshead Bay neighborhood. He wasn't just a volunteer helping out or an assistant coach in the background. He owned and operated the soccer camp, controlled all aspects of registration and programming, hired whatever staff he used, and set the entire tone and structure. To parents in the community, that level of ownership and control meant he was the person ultimately and completely responsible for their children's safety during camp hours. To the young girl at the center of this case, he was a trusted authority figure who had suddenly and terrifyingly transformed into someone else entirely. Rozovsky's personal background beyond his role in Brooklyn youth soccer is not widely documented in available public records. Born around 1970, he had been running youth soccer programs in the Marine Park and Sheepshead Bay areas of Brooklyn for a number of years. What is thoroughly documented in court records is the way he exploited an everyday, completely ordinary interaction, offering a child a treat after camp, a gesture that would seem kind and normal to any observer, as an opportunity to isolate that child and commit a serious crime. In the van, she later testified, he stopped acting like an adult in a position of care and responsibility. His actions made her frightened, confused, and desperate to escape. When she was finally able to leave the vehicle, she knew something terrible had happened, even if she didn't yet have all the words to describe it. Her caregivers, upon hearing what had occurred, immediately reported the incident to the New York City Police Department. Detectives from the NYPD's Special Victims Division, who are specially trained in interviewing child victims, launched an investigation. They confirmed that Rozovsky owned the camp, owned the vehicle in question, and had been alone with the girl at the time she described. She gave a detailed, consistent account of the incident to trained forensic interviewers at the Brooklyn Child Advocacy Center, a facility designed to minimize trauma to child victims during the investigative process. Prosecutors in the Kings County District Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence and determined there was more than sufficient basis to press criminal charges. In August 2022, Stanislav Rozovsky was arrested and subsequently indicted on multiple felony charges. The case proceeded to trial 2 years later. In Brooklyn Supreme Court, the now 12-year-old girl took the witness stand and, with remarkable courage, recounted what had happened to her in that van. The jury heard her testimony, reviewed the evidence, and deliberated. They found Rozovsky guilty of first-degree sexual abuse, acting in a manner injurious to a child under 17, and second-degree unlawful imprisonment. The convictions meant he faced significant prison time. At the August 2024 sentencing hearing, Kings County District Attorney Eric Gonzalez spoke publicly about the case, stating that Rozovsky had callously exploited his position of trust as a camp director to sexually abuse a young girl, and emphasizing that his office would continue to aggressively prosecute such violations of children's safety. Justice Danny Chun, After hearing victim impact statements from the girl's family about the lasting harm and trauma, sentenced Rozovsky to 7 years in prison, to be followed by 10 years of post-release supervision. The judge also ordered him to register as a sex offender under New York law, a requirement that will follow him for the rest of his life. As of November 2025, Stanislav Rozovsky is serving that 7-year term in a New York State correctional facility. The girl whose courage and clarity started this case and brought it to a successful conclusion may never have to see him again, but her decision to tell her family what happened and then to speak in court fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life and quite possibly prevented other children from being harmed in the same way. Her voice mattered. Her truth was heard. The image of a coach buying ice cream for a young camper after practice is so utterly typical, so woven into the fabric of American youth sports culture, that most of us wouldn't give it a second thought if we saw it happening. That very ordinariness, that mundane quality, is precisely what makes cases like Rozovsky's so deeply unsettling. There is no ominous music, no dark alley, no stranger in a mask. There is just a whistle around a neck, a familiar van in a parking lot, and a brief moment when a child has to decide whether to tell someone what happened, and whether anyone will believe her when she does. The specific details differ significantly. Different sports ranging from football to swimming to wrestling to volleyball. Different countries spanning from the United States to Ireland to the United Kingdom. Different decades from the 1970s through the 2020s. And different methods from physical isolation to digital grooming to spiritual manipulation. Each man occupied a role in society that carries almost automatic respect and deference. Coach, mentor, trainer, camp director, residential care staff. Each deliberately used that role, that position of trust and authority to gain access to children and teenagers who were supposed to be under their protection. These cases also reveal something profoundly troubling about the systems, institutions, and cultures that surrounded these men. The testimony of survivors, their willingness to come forward despite the personal cost, is the single thread that connects all 10 of these stories and transforms them from tragedies into accounts of resilience, justice, and hope. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these abusers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.